G'day. In this video, we're actually going to be looking at triggers and making certain events happen at certain times. So making our games do things when we want them to. Now, a trigger is something when we walk through or one object collides with another object, it can actually trigger an event. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a simple scene over on the side here. So the very first thing that we're going to do is in my standard assets, I'm just going to bring in the first person character controller and I'll just bring him out of the ground. Now if you don't have that, you can go to Assets, Import Package, Character Controller, and that will appear in your Assets window. From here, we don't need to control him too much, but if I was just to hit play right now, I can walk around using the WAS and D key and the mouse to look. So it actually gives me that viewpoint. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a bit of a map for him to walk around. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through and create another cube. Now this cube is actually in the best spot, so let's just move that one across. And I'm actually going to make that one a little bit longer. So it's like a bit of a starting point, starting race. The next part is I'm actually just going to duplicate that by pressing Ctrl D and creating a bit of a link like that. Okay. So in between these two posts, I'm actually going to again create another one just by duplicating, Ctrl D, and I'm actually going to make this one a little bit differently in shape. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit wider. I'm going to try and put it in between those two posts. I'm going to make it a little bit shorter as well. So what we can see is in between those two poles, we can actually see it. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this collider a trigger. And to do that is if on the inspector window, with the correct cube selected, I'm actually going to firstly rename it. And I'm just going to call this one a checkpoint. Doesn't matter what it's called, it's just the way that I'm calling it, so I can tell it's different. And the two cubes, I'm actually going to call post 1 and post 2. So checkpoint, post 1, post 2. Now post 1 and post 2 are only going to be there just so I know where my checkpoint is. But you don't necessarily need those posts. From here, with the checkpoint selected, I'm going to go along and scroll down to look for the component of my collider. Now if you've used a cube, it should be a box collider by default, and just by clicking Is Trigger will allow us to go through the next step. So let's click Is Trigger and we'll hit play. From here, you'll actually see that I've got my shapes like this. So my post, I can't walk through, I can't get through that. My other post, I also can't get through that. However, when I go to the actual bit in between that I turned into a trigger, I can walk straight through that one. And the reason why I can walk straight through it is a trigger rather than a solid object. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm not a big fan of actually this big grey thing. I don't want all these grey objects around. So I'm actually going to go through and actually get rid of one of these components. Now the component that makes it look the way it does is a mesh renderer, which you can see here. And I'm actually going to right button or normal click on the gear icon and go remove component. Instantly you get rid of the material, it's no longer grey, but you can see that green outline of a box that was, and that's the actual collider that we have. So again, if I go back to play, that grey box is gone. However, if I was to actually go back to the scene view, you'll actually see that that green box outline is still there. The collider is still there. It's just that we can't see it. It's invisible. So what we actually need to do is we need to actually have something occur when we actually have the first person controller go through it. So we need to create a script. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my assets section, go to scripts, right button click, go create a new JavaScript, and I'm going to call this one triggers. And double click to open that one up. Now the main thing is in regards to triggers, we really want to actually go through and learn exactly what's actually occurring here. How do we get a trigger to work? So I'm going to go to my scripting reference, and we've already learned how to actually search for triggers, and I've already got this one up for us. It says on trigger enter is called when the collider other enters the trigger. So when it enters the trigger, that one should do us. Let's go through, copy the code, and replace what was there. Now, we can save it, turning the bar green, and we can actually say that function on trigger. It's just like function update or function on GUI, but it's on trigger enter. It's actually got other collider when it collides with another object, and then we actually have destroy other.game object. So we're not actually going to be able to see this destruction, so I'm actually going to remove this line and replace it with a debug.log. Now debug.log basically gives me an error or a message in the console window of I hit a trigger. And that will tell me that it's actually working. So I'm actually going to go back to Unity, and it's already given me an error for a semicolon. So I'll place that semicolon in, save it, go back, make sure I'll give it 2 seconds to load, and there we go. The very first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to place that trigger onto my first person controller. And the reason why I'm doing that and placing it on the first person controller is so I can actually collide with multiple objects. It will be easier to set up. So from here I can hit play, and you'll notice down in the bottom left corner, just above the Start and Internet Explorer icon, that I have no message in the console. I can walk into a poll and no message appears, no matter what side I'm walking into. However, as soon as I walk through these polls, it says I hit a trigger. And that record, or that when it goes through that green box, it recognizes that it went through a trigger. And just to show you again, one thing that I didn't show you was I can walk on either side of the poll. I can walk around the system, but you don't see that message until I walk straight through it. So that shows me that my trigger is working. So let's do something a little bit more interesting than just a message appearing in the console. Let's actually create a particle effect appear. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to use instantiate. Now there will be another video that has been created or will be created showing you how to instantiate. And we're actually going to create a variable called particle effect. And we'll keep that in lowercase. We're going to put a position on that one, so transform.position of just exactly where it actually hits, and a rotation just to make sure it's going the right direction. So from there I'm going to save it, and the reason why this isn't going to work just yet because I have to set up my variable. So I want this object to be created, but the game doesn't know what that object is yet. So let's go ahead and create a new variable called particle effect, and it could be called anything. You could call it Purple Monkey Dishwasher if you wanted to. However, as a result, it's going to need to make a bit of sense, so always keep that in mind. We're going to define that as a game object, and now we know what particle effect is, and we can instantiate that. So we'll go back to Unity, see if it throws any errors, and it has, and it's always those semicolons I seem to forget. Give it 2 seconds to catch up, and there we go. So what we actually want to do is we actually now can see on our first person controller, under our triggers script, we now have this particle effect field for an empty game object. Now coincidentally, I've actually created a new particle effect, just called particle glow. And from here, I can click and drag that particle glow. Now, to see what that particle glow is, I'll just drag it onto the scene for 2 seconds. Very, very simple. It's just yellow particles spearing up, and they'll last for about 4 seconds. So there is a bit of a stopping time. So what we'll see is when I enter the field, rather than the message appearing in the bottom left, a big yellow effect will occur. So I can walk all the way around again without any real issue. I can move around, look everywhere, but I can't see any yellow effect until I walk straight through. And as soon as I walk through, I get a particle effect going through. And you can see that happening there. Okay. So from that, we've actually learned how to use triggers. But how would we use it to, let's say, get rid of health or to make it hit a certain checkpoint? Well, that all comes down to our variables and what we're putting inside it. So instead of putting those two in, so I'll just comment those out, which means it won't actually run those two commands. I could put a whole heap of different things in here. I could actually go through and state that the health is equal to health minus 1. I could do something along the lines of teleporting player to this area. And obviously this part here is all pseudocode, which means it's not quite correct. It's only just working to show you how it can go. I could also go through things along the lines of saying checkpoint reached equals 1. So if I've got a car racing game, I could say that the checkpoint reached equals 1 or 2 or 3. So I can check off each time a car goes through a checkpoint to make sure they don't just go over the mountain and finish off the race in 2 seconds. They actually have to go around the track. So there's a whole heap of different things I can put in place, but rather than putting that stuff in, I put in a simple particle effect being cast, and that's what I wanted that to trigger. So again, when you're actually going through and creating triggers, make sure it's doing what you need it to do. Set it up the size, so I only wanted it in between those two posts. And as soon as I walk through, I got my action to occur. In this case, it was a particle effect. If you have any questions in regards to any of the stuff that's seen in this video, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm happy to always record more videos if the need is required. One thing I will just point out just before I finish off this video, make sure whenever you actually are selecting and you reselect that checkpoint, that green box is still there, you do need to watch for the gap in between the post and that. Sometimes you'll actually have a player that will walk right next to the post and it won't trigger depending on the size of your character. So it's always good habit to make sure that it is actually going exactly all the way up to the sides so the player can't actually skip that particular trigger, particularly if it's a trigger you want them to occur.